The house is sold. Find another place to live, my brother shouted. I sacrificed 2 years for my sick mother, but after a 13-hour shift, they changed the locks and dumped my belongings outside. As the door slammed, the cruel truth crushed me. Welcome back to Van's Rock Stories. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones we spent years trying to protect. If you've ever sacrificed everything for your family and wondered whether they'd do the same for you, you're going to understand this story. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And if you enjoy emotional family stories with unexpected twists, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. My name is Grace Sullivan. I'm 35 years old, and I work as an occupational therapist at a rehabilitation hospital. Helping people rebuild their lives had always made sense to me. What never made sense was what my own family did to mine. The morning it happened, I had just finished a 13-hour overnight shift. My shoulders ached, my feet felt numb, and all I wanted was a hot shower before driving my mom to her dialysis appointment later that afternoon. I turned onto my street, already thinking about coffee. Then I noticed something strange in front of our house. Boxes. A lot of them. At first I assumed someone nearby was moving, but as I pulled into the driveway, my stomach tightened. Those weren't just random boxes. They were mine. 11 cardboard boxes sat across the front lawn beside 2 old suitcases and several plastic storage bags. My winter coat was sticking out of one box. A framed photo I'd kept since college leaned against another. Even the small blue lamp from my bedroom had been tossed into a plastic bin without any wrapping. I parked so quickly I barely remembered turning off the engine. What? I hurried across the yard, looking from one box to another. No. This had to be some mistake. I grabbed my house key and walked to the front door. It wouldn't turn. I frowned and tried again. Nothing. I checked the key, looked at the lock, then tried one more time. Still nothing. The locks had been changed. I knocked. Once. Twice. Then harder. A minute later, the door opened only a few inches. My older brother Daniel stood behind it. He didn't look surprised to see me. He looked impatient. "There you are," he said flatly. "What happened to the lock?" "I changed it." I laughed nervously. "Okay. Why?" "Because you don't live here anymore." For a second, I honestly thought he was joking. I even smiled. "Very funny. I just got off work." "Can you unlock the door?" He didn't move. Instead, he folded his arms. "The house is sold." I stared at him. "What?" "I said the house is sold. You'll have to find somewhere else to live." I waited for him to smile. He never did. "Daniel, stop. I'm exhausted." "I'm serious." "No, you're not." "I am." I looked past him, trying to see into the hallway. "Where's Mom?" "Inside." "I need to talk to her." "She doesn't want to talk." I blinked. "What do you mean she doesn't want to talk?" His jaw tightened. "Grace, don't make this harder than it has to be." "Harder?" I pointed at the lawn. "You packed my entire life into boxes. You should have taken them already. I didn't even know I was moving." A curtain in the living room shifted. For the briefest second, I thought I saw someone standing behind it. "Mom?" I called. No answer. I stepped toward the doorway, but Daniel immediately blocked it. "You can't come in. This is my home." "It was." I shook my head. "No, something's wrong. Mom would never agree to this. You need to leave." Let me hear her say that. Silence. Then I raised my voice. "Mom, it's Grace. Can you please come talk to me?" The house became so quiet that I could hear a dog barking somewhere down the street. I waited. Nothing. I called again. "Mom, please." A few seconds later, I heard footsteps inside. Hope rushed through me. Daniel glanced over his shoulder but didn't move away from the door. A woman's voice came from deeper inside the house. Soft, weak, but unmistakably my mother's. Daniel. He looked toward her, then back at me. She said she's not coming. My chest tightened. I didn't ask you. He hesitated for only a moment before repeating her exact words. She doesn't want to see you. And before I could say another word, he slowly closed the door. The door clicked shut right in front of me. I stood there for several seconds with my hand still raised, waiting for it to open again. It didn't. I knocked one more time. Mom? Please. I just need 5 minutes. Nothing. Not even footsteps. I pulled out my phone and called her. 1 ring, 2. Straight to voicemail. I frowned and tried again. Voicemail. My chest tightened as I sent a text. Mom, what's going on? Please talk to me. The message showed as delivered. No reply. I called Daniel next. He declined the call before it even rang. Then my older sister Melissa. She answered on the 3rd ring. Grace. Thank God. Can you tell me what's happening? A long pause. I think it's better if you leave. I blinked. You too? It's already done. What does that even mean? The house belongs to someone else now. I've lived here for 2 years. I know. I helped Mom every single week. I know. Then why is everyone acting like I don't exist? Melissa let out a quiet sigh. Please don't make a scene in front of the neighborhood. A scene? I looked around for the first time. Curtains were moving. 2 houses down, someone was pretending to water flowers while watching me. Across the street, a man had stopped washing his truck. Everyone had noticed. I just want to talk to Mom. I don't think that's a good idea. Who decided that? Another silence. Then she answered so softly I almost missed it. We all agreed. The words hit harder than Daniel slamming the door. Not just him, not one bad decision. Everyone. I have to go, Melissa whispered before ending the call. I lowered my phone without realizing my hand was shaking. A car slowed beside the curb. Mrs. Henderson, our next-door neighbor, stepped out carrying a grocery bag. She looked uncomfortable the moment our eyes met. Oh, Grace. Did you know about this? She hesitated. I didn't know all the details. But you knew. She nodded reluctantly. I saw the moving truck this morning. This morning? They started around 8. I stared at the boxes scattered across the lawn. I was working. I figured. I didn't even know. She shifted the grocery bag to her other arm. I asked your brother if everything was okay. He said you'd already found another place and couldn't be here because of work. I laughed once. Not because anything was funny, because I couldn't believe how easily that lie had been told. He said that? I'm sorry. Mrs. Henderson reached into one of the boxes after noticing a picture frame had fallen sideways. She carefully stood it back up before looking at me again. I almost called you. What stopped you? He said your whole family had agreed. There it was again. Your whole family. I thanked her anyway. None of this was her fault. She squeezed my arm gently before heading inside, still glancing back with a guilty expression. I sat on one of the suitcases and looked at everything I owned spread across the cold grass. 2 years of my life had somehow been reduced to cardboard boxes. I unlocked my phone again. No calls, no messages. The only notification was a reminder from the hospital about tomorrow's patient schedule. For a strange moment, normal life kept moving while mine had completely stopped. I rubbed my face and tried calling Mom one last time. Voicemail. I whispered, almost without thinking. Just tell me what I did. The wind pushed one of the loose papers across the driveway. I caught it before it disappeared into the street. It was an old pharmacy receipt. My name was on it. The date made me stop. 2 years earlier. Back when none of this had happened. Back when my mother had gotten the diagnosis that changed everything, and I made the decision that brought me back to this house. I turned the pharmacy receipt over in my hand. The faded date pulled me back to a morning I could still remember in painful detail. 2 years earlier. Mom had been sitting in a hospital room staring at the floor while the nephrologist explained what chronic kidney disease would mean for the rest of her life. There were words like dialysis, treatment plan, and lifestyle changes. Mom barely spoke. Daniel asked questions about insurance. Melissa cried quietly beside the window. I listened. Not because I wasn't scared, because someone had to understand every instruction before we left that room. The doctor handed us a thick folder. There will be appointments several times a week, he explained. She'll need someone she can rely on, especially in the beginning. I looked at Mom. She smiled, but it wasn't convincing. I'll manage, she said. She had always said that, even when she couldn't. Outside the hospital, we stood in silence beside our cars. Daniel checked his watch. I've got a meeting in 40 minutes. Melissa hugged Mom quickly. I'll visit this weekend. Then both of them drove away. I stayed. Mom climbed into the passenger seat of my car without saying much. Halfway home, she looked out the window and quietly asked, "Do you think I'm becoming a burden?" I almost hit the brakes. No. You don't have to answer so fast. I answered that fast because I mean it. She nodded, but she kept looking outside. That evening, I followed her around the house more than I realized. She tried carrying a laundry basket. I took it from her. She reached for groceries. I grabbed those too. Finally, she laughed. Grace, I still have 2 working arms. I know. You don't have to treat me like I'm made of glass. I'm just trying to help. She smiled again. This time, it looked real. I know you are. A few days later, I sat alone in my apartment. It wasn't anything fancy, a small 1-bedroom place close to the hospital. I'd spent years making it feel like home. My lease still had 8 months left. I looked around the living room, the bookshelf I'd assembled myself, the coffee mugs collected from weekend trips, the balcony where I'd drink coffee before early shifts. Then I looked at my calendar. Dialysis appointments, follow-up visits, medication reviews, physical therapy evaluations, driving across town from my apartment to Mom's house before work, then back again after 12-hour shifts. I grabbed my phone. The leasing office answered on the second ring. Riverside Apartments, this is Angela. Hi, this is Grace Sullivan from Unit 214. Hi, Grace, what can I help you with? I took a slow breath. I need to break my lease. There was a pause. I'm sorry to hear that. Is everything okay? My mom's sick. She didn't ask another question. We'll explain the early termination process. The cancellation fee wasn't small. Neither was hiring movers. But I signed every document without changing my mind. A week later, I was carrying boxes back into the same house I'd left years before. Mom stood near the front door looking guilty. You didn't have to give up your apartment. I wanted to. You love that place. I love you more. She looked away quickly, pretending to organize a stack of mail. I knew she was trying not to cry. Living together again felt strange at first. We had different routines. I worked long shifts. She was exhausted after treatments. Some evenings we'd barely exchange more than a few sentences before falling asleep. Other nights we'd sit in the kitchen sharing leftover soup while talking about patients I'd helped, or old stories from when I was a kid. Little by little, it stopped feeling temporary. It started feeling like family again. Then one Saturday afternoon, Daniel spread a folder across the dining room table. I've been looking over everyone's expenses, he said. He tapped a page filled with numbers. If we're going to make this work, we need to stop treating our money separately. Melissa nodded almost immediately. Mom looked uncertain. Daniel turned toward me. I've got an idea. He slid a bank application across the table. Let's open one shared family account. Everyone contributes, and I'll manage the bills from there. Daniel pushed the paperwork a little closer to me. It'll make everything easier, he said. One account, one place to pay the mortgage, utilities, Mom's medical bills, groceries, everything. Melissa nodded. I already transferred my share. Mom looked back and forth between us. I don't want you kids fighting over money because of me. We won't, Daniel answered quickly. I'll keep track of every expense. Then he looked at me. What do you think? Honestly, I was too exhausted to overanalyze it. I worked in rehab, not finance. Daniel had always been the organized one. He liked spreadsheets, budgets, and planning ahead. If someone had to manage bills, it made sense that it would be him. If this helps Mom, I said, I'm in. He smiled for the first time that evening. Good. Looking back, I remember thinking we were finally acting like a team. For a while, it actually felt that way. My life settled into a routine that revolved around Mom. I worked 4 long shifts every week at the rehabilitation hospital. On treatment days, I'd wake up before sunrise, help Mom get ready, and drive her to the dialysis center before heading to work. Some evenings, I picked her up still wearing my hospital badge because I didn't even have time to stop at home. Other days, I'd grocery shop during my lunch break, answering work emails while standing in checkout lines. It became normal. Not easy. Just normal. Mom noticed more than she admitted. One night, she found me asleep at the kitchen table with patient notes spread around my laptop. She gently touched my shoulder. Grace. I woke up immediately. I'm sorry. I must have... You fell asleep sitting up. I rubbed my eyes. What time is it? Almost midnight. You should have woken me sooner. You needed the sleep. I smiled. So do you. She reached over and squeezed my hand. I hate that your life has become hospital, then me, then hospital again. It hasn't. She gave me the kind of look mothers give when they know you're lying to protect them. I changed the subject before she could argue. Money became part of that routine too. Every payday, I'd transfer most of my paycheck into the shared family account. Daniel usually texted me a reminder before I even got home. Mortgage due Friday. Insurance payment cleared. Mom's medication cost more this month. I never questioned it. I'd open my banking app, move the money, and keep enough for gas, lunch at work, and a few personal expenses. That was it. A couple of coworkers noticed. You never come out with us anymore, my friend Lauren said one afternoon after a staff meeting. We're grabbing dinner. I can't. You always say that. I've got somewhere to be. She tilted her head. Grace, are you taking care of everyone except yourself? I laughed softly. I'll survive. She didn't laugh back. You keep saying that like it's the same thing as living. Her words stayed with me longer than I expected. Still, I kept choosing the same routine, because every time I thought about slowing down, I'd picture Mom sitting quietly during dialysis. Nothing else seemed as important. Months passed. The transfers became automatic. Daniel sent monthly summaries that looked professional enough. Columns, totals, medical expenses, household costs. Everything appeared organized. Whenever I thanked him for handling the finances, he'd shrug. Somebody has to. I believed him. Completely. Then one evening, after transferring another paycheck, I stayed on my banking app a little longer than usual. Not because I suspected anything. I had simply opened the wrong menu while checking my balance. A list of recent account activity appeared. Most of it looked familiar. Utility payments, the pharmacy, the grocery store. Then one transaction caught my eye. I leaned closer to the screen. The amount wasn't small. It wasn't a hospital. It wasn't a utility company. It was a transfer to a personal account. I read the name twice. Daniel Sullivan. My thumb froze above the screen as I stared at the number. I was sitting in my car outside the dialysis center, staring at my banking app instead of driving away. Mom had finally fallen asleep after another exhausting treatment. I'd helped her into the house, made sure she took her medication, then stepped back outside to transfer my paycheck into our family account. It was routine. Payday. Transfer. Don't think about it. As I scrolled through the transaction history, one withdrawal caught my attention. $5,000. The description only said internal transfer. I frowned and refreshed the page. Another transfer. 8,000. Then another. 6,500. None of them matched hospital bills, prescriptions, or mortgage payments. Every one of them had gone to the same account. I tapped the details. The account belonged to my brother, Daniel. For a moment, I assumed there had to be a reasonable explanation. Daniel handled all the finances while I focused on Mom's care. Insurance paperwork, bills, appointments. He always insisted he'd take care of everything. When I got home, I found him organizing boxes in the garage. "Hey," I said. He smiled. "Long shift? When isn't it? What happened?" I held up my phone. "I was checking the account. There are several transfers to your personal account." His expression barely changed. "Oh, I forgot to tell you." I waited. "I've been paying some expenses myself first," he said. "Repairs, taxes, things like that. I thought those came directly from the family account. Most of them do." "Then why move the money into your account?" He shrugged. "It was easier." The answer felt incomplete. "You kept records, right?" "Of course." "Can I see them?" He looked at me for a second before letting out a tired sigh. "Grace, do you really think I'd steal from Mom?" "No." "Then trust me." I hesitated. Daniel had always been the responsible one. I wanted to believe him. "I'll show you everything this weekend," he added. I nodded. "Okay." As I walked back inside, I convinced myself I was letting stress get the better of me. Mom was fighting kidney disease. Daniel was buried in paperwork. I was working overtime. Maybe none of us were thinking clearly anymore. So I tried to let it go. For a while, life slipped back into the same exhausting routine. Hospital, dialysis, laundry, night shifts. Repeat. One morning, Mom studied my face over breakfast. "You're losing weight." "I'm okay." "No, you're wearing yourself out." I smiled anyway. "We're getting through this together." She reached over and squeezed my hand, but neither of us said anything else. A few days later, Daniel came home carrying grocery bags. "I found someone who can help with a few repairs," he said. "What kind of repairs?" "The house needs some work sooner or later." Mom looked concerned. "Is it expensive?" "I've got it handled," Daniel answered before I could. That phrase stayed with me. "I've got it handled." A couple of weeks later, one of my patients canceled unexpectedly, so I got home much earlier than usual. A black SUV was parked in the driveway. Two strangers stood outside with Daniel. One carried a clipboard. The other was taking photos of the house. Not casual photos. They were photographing the roof, the yard, the front windows, even the driveway. I stayed inside my car, watching. These weren't contractors. Then the man opened a folder. A real estate company logo was printed across the front. My grip tightened around the steering wheel. Before I could step out of the car, Daniel turned toward me, and our eyes met. Daniel held my gaze for a second, then casually excused himself from the two visitors and walked toward my car before I could even open the door. "You got home early." "A patient canceled." He nodded like that explained everything. I glanced past him at the man with the folder. "I thought you said someone was coming to look at the roof." "They are? They're with a real estate company." Daniel didn't even turn around. "They also handle property evaluations." "For roof repairs?" "They work with contractors." His answer came so quickly it sounded rehearsed. The couple didn't stay much longer. Before leaving, the woman handed Daniel a folder, shook his hand, and smiled. As they drove away, I noticed Daniel tuck the folder under his arm before walking back inside. I wanted to ask to see it. I didn't. That evening, Mom was unusually cheerful. Daniel had ordered takeout from her favorite Italian restaurant, and for a little while the house almost felt normal again. Mom laughed when Daniel teased her about secretly stealing extra breadsticks. "You two still argue like you're 12, she said. "We're just discussing financial accountability," Daniel joked. I forced a smile. He caught my eye across the table. For a second, neither of us said anything. The conversation moved on, but something had shifted. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Enough that I noticed. Over the next few weeks, the strange visits didn't stop. Sometimes it was the same SUV, sometimes a different car, different people, same clipboards, same polite smiles. Every time I asked, Daniel had another explanation. Insurance inspection, tax assessment, a contractor's assistant, a refinance consultation. None of the answers matched the last one. I started remembering them without meaning to. One afternoon I came home and found fresh measuring marks on the side of the garage. Another evening there were small colored flags pushed into the lawn. A week later, someone was taking photos of the backyard again. Whenever I asked, Daniel always had a reason. "They're checking drainage. The county requested it. It's nothing. Nothing." That word became his favorite answer. Work kept me too busy to chase every question. My shifts were still long, and Mom's dialysis schedule hadn't gotten any easier. She depended on me for almost everything outside the house. I couldn't imagine abandoning her over a feeling I couldn't prove. Still, I quietly changed one thing. When payday came, I transferred most of my paycheck into the family account like always. But not all of it. I left a small amount in my personal savings. Just enough for emergencies. It felt strangely uncomfortable, almost like I was hiding money from my own family. When Daniel glanced at the banking notification on the kitchen counter a few days later, he casually asked, "Didn't you get paid yesterday?" I did. I didn't see the full deposit. I kept a little for myself. He looked surprised. "For what?" "I've barely used my own account in 2 years. I figured I should keep a cushion." He studied me for a moment before shrugging. "Fair enough." The conversation ended there. But afterward, I noticed he started asking more questions whenever payday came. Nothing confrontational, just curious. That weekend, I finally logged into the savings account I hadn't paid much attention to since moving back home. I expected to see enough money for a fresh start whenever Mom recovered. Instead, the balance made me blink. I refreshed the screen. The number didn't change. Over 2 years of savings, almost gone. I slowly scrolled through months of transfers leaving the account. Almost everyone had been authorized by me, back when I believed every dollar was helping keep our family afloat. I stared at the remaining balance for a long time. There wasn't enough left to rent an apartment for more than a few weeks. I locked my phone and looked around the motel room I'd rented for one night. 2 duffel bags sat against the wall. A few cardboard boxes were stacked beside the door. Everything else was still crammed inside my old sedan because I couldn't afford another night if I didn't have to. I hadn't slept much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my belongings scattered across the front lawn. I kept hoping I'd wake up and realize none of it had happened. Instead, my phone stayed silent. No missed calls. No messages from Mom. Nothing from Daniel. Around mid-morning, I drove back to the neighborhood one last time. Not to argue. Just to collect the last few things that hadn't fit into my car. The new locks were still there. My brother's truck was parked in the driveway. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment before knocking. Daniel answered almost immediately. "You shouldn't be here. I only came for the rest of my things." I boxed everything. "I know there are still a few storage bins in the garage. They're staying with the house. They're mine. They're inside now." His voice stayed calm, almost businesslike. "I'm not trying to fight with you," I said quietly. "I just want my belongings." "I can't let you in. You can't, or you won't. He didn't answer. The door closed. Not slammed, just closed. It somehow hurt even more. I called the non-emergency police line from my car. About 20 minutes later, an officer met me outside the house. He listened patiently while I explained everything. I lived here for 2 years. I helped pay the bills. My belongings are still inside. He nodded. Then he knocked on the door himself. Daniel spoke with him for only a few minutes before handing over what looked like paperwork. The officer came back looking sympathetic. I'm sorry, ma'am. So you'll help me get my things? I can't force entry, but that's my home. If the property has legally changed ownership or the residents refuse entry, this becomes a civil matter. Civil? You'll need to speak with an attorney. I looked at him in disbelief. They changed the locks while I was at work. I understand. No, I don't think you do. He sighed. I wish there were more I could do. He handed me a small card with information about legal aid offices. Most of them were closed for the Thanksgiving holiday. I thanked him anyway. None of this was his fault. Before leaving, I called my aunt. Straight to voicemail. My cousin answered but sounded uncomfortable the moment I explained what had happened. I'm really sorry, Grace. Did you know? A long pause. I heard they sold the house. You knew? I thought they had talked to you already. They didn't. I'm sorry. She sounded genuine, but she still didn't offer me a place to stay. Neither did anyone else. By late afternoon, I'd called nearly everyone I could think of. Friends had relatives visiting for Thanksgiving. One coworker was out of town. Another offered to ask around, but nothing was available that night. For the first time, I realized something that hurt almost as much as being thrown out. No one in my family had spoken up for me. Not one person had called to ask where I was sleeping. The sun was already dropping when I pulled out of the neighborhood. I told myself I'd find another inexpensive motel. Maybe something farther outside the city. I had enough money for a few more nights if I was careful. The old sedan rattled as I turned onto the highway. It had over 200,000 miles on it, but it had never completely let me down. Until then. A loud cough came from under the hood. The steering wheel vibrated. Then another sputter. I eased onto the shoulder just as the engine lost power. I turned the key again. Nothing. Only a weak clicking sound answered me. I rested both hands on the steering wheel and stared through the windshield. For the first time since I'd been thrown out, I truly had nowhere left to go. The engine wouldn't start no matter how many times I turned the key. Click, click, silence. I leaned back against the seat and let out a long breath. This old car had survived snowstorms, 12-hour commutes, and countless trips to the dialysis center. It picked today to give up. I called roadside assistance through my insurance. They promised someone would arrive within an hour. It turned into almost 2. By the time the tow truck came, the sky was already getting dark. The driver was an older man named Mike. He listened quietly while hooking up my car. Where do you want me to tow it? The cheapest repair shop you know? He gave me a sympathetic look. They're all closing early because of Thanksgiving. Of course they are. He scratched his chin. I can leave it at a shop, but nobody's looking at it until after the holiday. That's fine. As we reached the garage, the mechanic took one quick look before locking up. Can't promise anything until Friday. Any idea what it might be? Could be the starter. Could be worse. That wasn't exactly comforting. I grabbed my bags from the back seat. Without the car, I suddenly realized I was carrying almost everything I still owned. I checked prices at a few nearby motels on my phone. Holiday weekend. Almost every room had doubled in price. The cheapest one was more than I could comfortably afford. I booked one night anyway. The room smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet, but it had a bed and a hot shower. That was enough. I sat on the edge of the mattress staring at my phone. My thumb hovered over one contact. Megan, my closest friend since graduate school. I hated asking for help, but I was running out of options. She answered on the second ring. Grace? Are you okay? I need a favor. She heard something in my voice immediately. What happened? I told her everything. Not every detail. Just enough. When I finished, there was a long silence. Oh my God. I know. You can stay with us. Relief washed over me. For about 3 seconds. Then I heard muffled voices in the background. She covered the phone before speaking again. Grace. It's okay. No, listen. My parents are here. My sister's family flew in yesterday. My in-laws are arriving tonight. She sounded miserable. There are 11 people sleeping in our house. I laughed softly, not because it was funny, because somehow that made perfect sense. You don't even have a couch? My teenage nephews are already fighting over it. She sighed. If I had any space at all, you'd already be here. I know. I mean it. I know. She offered to pay for another motel night. I thanked her but said no. You've done enough just answering the phone. Promise you'll call me tomorrow. I promise. After we hung up, I realized something. She had tried. Unlike my family. I spent the next hour searching online. Every affordable motel was either full or booked through the holiday weekend. I looked at extended stay hotels. Too expensive. Short-term rentals. Too expensive. Even hostels were nearly full. I closed the app. For the first time in years, I didn't know where I'd sleep after checkout. The thought was strangely embarrassing. I'd spent my career helping patients rebuild their independence. Now I couldn't answer a simple question. Where are you staying tonight? The motel clerk noticed me sitting in the lobby long after I'd checked out the next morning. You waiting for someone? He asked. I'm figuring out my next step. He hesitated. I don't usually say this. He reached under the counter and handed me a folded community flyer. Some local churches open temporary shelters during Thanksgiving week. I thanked him and slipped the paper into my pocket. Most of the listings were across town. One address caught my attention. It was closer than the others. As I walked toward the bus stop with my suitcase rolling behind me, I looked up. Just across the intersection stood a weathered blue sign, St. Mark's Community Shelter. An arrow pointed toward the church parking lot. I stood outside the church for almost a full minute before walking in. People came and went through the side entrance carrying blankets, backpacks, and grocery bags. No one looked at me twice. For some reason, that made it easier. Inside, the fellowship hall had been turned into a temporary shelter. Rows of folding cots stretched across the room. A few families sat quietly together. Some people were eating soup. Others simply stared at the floor. A volunteer with a kind smile walked over. Hi, first time here? I nodded. I'm Grace. I'm Linda. She handed me a clipboard. We just need some basic information. I filled out the form, feeling strangely embarrassed writing no current address. Linda pretended not to notice. When she finished, she pointed toward an empty cot. You can leave your things there. Dinner's still being served if you're hungry. I appreciate it. I wasn't sure I could eat. The room was much quieter than I'd expected. No shouting, no chaos. Just tired people trying to make it through another day. I set my suitcase beside the cot and sat down. Across the room, a little boy laughed while another volunteer helped him build a tower out of paper cups. His mother smiled for the first time since I'd walked in. That small moment somehow made the room feel warmer. A few minutes later, Linda stopped beside me. You work in healthcare? I looked up. How did you know? You keep watching people the way nurses do. I laughed softly. Close. I'm an occupational therapist. That explains it. She smiled before hurrying away. Dinner was simple. Soup, bread, and coffee. I carried my tray to an empty table. Before I even sat down, I noticed an elderly man nearby struggling to lift his spoon. His hands shook badly. One of the younger volunteers looked unsure what to do. Without thinking, I stood. "Mind if I help?" The volunteer looked relieved. "Please." I knelt beside the man. "Hi, sir. My name's Grace." He gave me a tired smile. "My arthritis is acting up today." "I can see that." I adjusted the position of his chair and slid a folded towel under his forearm for support. "Try now." His hand steadied enough to bring the spoon to his mouth. "Well," he chuckled. "That's better." The young volunteer blinked. "How did you know to do that?" "I work with patients every day." She smiled. "I wish we'd had you yesterday." The rest of the evening passed differently than I'd expected. Someone asked me to help an older woman safely transfer from her wheelchair. Another volunteer wanted advice for a guest recovering from a stroke. None of it felt like work. It felt familiar, comforting even. For a few hours, I stopped thinking about the house, about Daniel, about everything I'd lost. I was simply helping people. And for the first time in days, I felt useful again. Before lights out, Linda handed me a cup of hot tea. "You didn't have to spend your evening helping." "I know. But thank you." She hesitated. "If you're still here tomorrow, we'd love the extra hands." I smiled. "I'll see how things go." As people settled onto their cots, I pulled the thin blanket over my shoulders. It wasn't home, but it was warm. And no one here had made me feel unwanted. I looked around the room one last time. That's when I noticed her. An elderly woman sitting alone near the far wall. She hadn't spoken to anyone all evening. Instead, she had been quietly watching me. The moment our eyes met, she didn't look away. She simply smiled, as if she had been expecting me. Grace caught me just as I finished helping one of the volunteers fold blankets. "Excuse me," she said softly. I turned, expecting her to ask where the coffee station was. Instead, I found the older woman from earlier standing a few feet away. She looked to be in her late 70s, maybe early 80s. She held herself with quiet confidence, wearing a dark wool coat that looked much nicer than anything most people wore inside the shelter. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said. "Not at all." "You have very gentle hands." I smiled awkwardly. "Occupational therapist." "I guessed as much." That surprised me. She motioned toward two empty chairs near the corner of the fellowship hall. "Would you mind sitting with me for a few minutes?" I hesitated. Normally, I would have politely declined. I was exhausted, emotionally drained, and honestly not in the mood for conversation. But there was something calm about her. I nodded. We sat down with paper cups of coffee that had long since gone lukewarm. "I'm Helen," she said. "Grace." "I know." I laughed quietly. "The volunteer called my name earlier." She smiled. "Yes, but that's not how I know it." Something in her expression made me stop smiling. She wasn't trying to scare me. She sounded almost relieved. "So," I asked carefully, "have we met before?" "No." "You know someone in my family?" Instead of answering immediately, she studied my face. "You have your grandmother's eyes." My heartbeat stumbled. "My grandmother?" She nodded. "Eleanor." I stared at her. Most people my age barely remembered my grandmother's name. She had passed away when I was still young. I frowned. "How do you know my grandmother?" Helen wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "We knew each other for many years." I searched my memory. Nothing. I had never seen this woman before. "My grandmother never mentioned you." I'm sure she couldn't. The answer only confused me more. "What does that mean?" Helen looked around the room before lowering her voice. "Some promises require silence." I blinked. "Okay, now you're making this sound like a mystery movie." She laughed for the first time. "I suppose I am?" For a moment, the conversation became unexpectedly comfortable. She asked about my work. I told her I specialized in helping patients recover everyday skills after strokes, spinal injuries, and surgeries. She listened carefully. When I mentioned taking care of my mother during dialysis treatments, something changed in her expression. Not pity, recognition. "You stayed," she whispered. "What?" "You stayed with your family." "Of course I did. No matter the cost?" I looked away. I didn't really think of it as a cost back then. She nodded slowly, almost like she'd expected that answer. "You sound exactly like her." "Like my grandmother?" Helen smiled without answering. The shelter around us buzzed with quiet conversation. Volunteers carried trays of soup between tables. Children laughed over a board game in one corner. For the first time in days, I didn't feel completely alone. Then Helen asked a question that made me freeze. "Your full name is Grace Sullivan." I nodded. "Correct?" "Yes." She closed her eyes for a brief second, almost as if she'd finally confirmed something she'd wondered about for years. "You're 35 now?" "Yes." "And your mother's name is Margaret?" "Yes." I leaned forward. "How do you know all of this?" She looked directly at me. "I've been hoping we'd meet someday." My stomach tightened. This can't be a coincidence. It isn't. I waited. She didn't rush. She reached into her handbag, but instead of taking anything out, she simply rested one hand on it. "I wasn't sure if I would recognize you. You were looking for me?" "In a way." I shook my head. "I don't understand." "I know." She gave me a kind smile. "You don't have to understand tonight." "Then tell me one thing." She took a slow breath. "Was my grandmother important to you?" Helen's eyes glistened. "Very." "Then why have I never heard your name?" "Because it wasn't time." That answer only created more questions. Before I could ask another, one of the volunteers called my name from across the room. "Grace, could you help us for just a second?" "I'll be right there." When I looked back at Helen, she gave me a reassuring nod. "We'll continue this conversation." "You promise?" "I do." I stood, still trying to process everything she'd said. As I turned to leave, Helen spoke one more time. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "Grace." I faced her again. She smiled with unmistakable relief. "I've been waiting almost 20 years to meet you." I couldn't stop thinking about what Helen had said. 20 years. She'd been waiting 20 years to meet me. That sentence echoed in my head while I helped clean up after dinner. I stacked paper plates, wiped down folding tables, and carried trash bags outside. But my mind kept drifting back to the woman who somehow knew my grandmother. By the time everything was finished, most of the guests had settled in for the night. Helen was waiting near the entrance, her coat folded neatly across her lap. "You came back," she said with a gentle smile. "I said I would." She motioned toward a quieter hallway just outside the fellowship room, where a few old photographs of church events hung on the walls. "I think it'll be easier to talk here." We sat on a wooden bench. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I broke the silence. "You said you knew my grandmother." "I did." "How?" Helen took a slow breath. "My full name is Helen Hayes." I nodded politely, unsure why that mattered. I spent most of my career working in estate law. That caught my attention. "You were an attorney?" She smiled. "Not exactly. I worked alongside attorneys for decades. I handled estate planning, trusts, wills, all the paperwork families usually avoid until it's too late." I leaned forward. "And my grandmother hired you?" "Many years ago." My stomach tightened. "I don't remember anyone mentioning you." "I'm not surprised." She didn't sound offended. "In my line of work, if people remember your name, it usually means something went wrong." That made me laugh despite everything. "I guess that's fair." Her smile faded as she looked at me. Your grandmother, Eleanor Sullivan, was one of the most thoughtful women I ever met. You really knew her. I did. What was she like? Helen didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at one of the stained glass windows across the hallway. She always planned ahead. That sounds like her. She worried about people she loved long before they realized they needed help. Something about that description hit me harder than I expected. It sounded exactly like the grandmother I barely remembered. I used to think she spoiled me, I admitted. Helen smiled. No. She believed you needed someone who loved you without conditions. The words settled heavily between us. I looked down at my hands. My family always said my grandmother favored me too much. And did you believe them? I didn't know what to believe. Helen studied me for a long moment. You still defend them? I opened my mouth to argue. Nothing came out. Maybe she was right. Even after being thrown out of the house, I was still trying to explain everyone's behavior instead of accepting what had happened. I don't want to think my family is cruel, I whispered. I know. I keep telling myself there has to be some explanation. Helen nodded sympathetically. Sometimes people hurt us because they're broken. She paused. And sometimes they simply choose themselves? Neither answer felt comforting. She reached into her leather handbag. For a second, I thought she was about to hand me a document. Instead, she rested her hand on a thick manila envelope without taking it out. I've carried something for a very long time. I frowned. What is it? I can't explain everything tonight. Why not? Because once I do, she gave me a careful look. Your understanding of your family may never be the same. I swallowed. Is this about the house? No. My mother? No. My brother? She shook her head again. This is about your grandmother. I stared at the envelope. Every logical part of me wanted to believe this was impossible. People didn't just appear in church shelters carrying decades-old secrets, but nothing about the last few days had been normal. Helen noticed my hesitation. You don't have to trust me yet. I barely know you. I understand. She carefully slid the envelope back into her bag. But your grandmother trusted me. Her voice softened, and she asked me to keep something safe. I looked directly at her. For who? Helen met my eyes without hesitation. For you. I stared at Helen's handbag, trying to decide whether this was real or if exhaustion was finally catching up with me. You've been carrying something for me? I asked. For many years. Why wouldn't my grandmother just give it to me herself? Helen's expression softened. She wanted to. That answer hit harder than I expected. But she passed away when I was still young. I know. Then why wait all this time? Helen folded her hands in her lap. Because that was Eleanor's instruction. I frowned. What instruction? She made me promise that nothing would be handed to you immediately after her death. I blinked. That doesn't make any sense. It didn't to me at first either. She smiled faintly, as if remembering an old conversation. I argued with her. You did? Oh, absolutely. That surprised me enough to make me smile. I told her she was making things unnecessarily complicated. And what did she say? Helen laughed quietly. She looked at me and said, "One day Grace will understand why timing matters more than truth." The words lingered between us. I looked away. My grandmother really said that? Almost word for word. A strange feeling settled in my chest. I barely remembered my grandmother's voice anymore. Yet somehow, hearing Helen repeat those words made her feel closer than she had in years. So, I said carefully, when was I supposed to receive whatever she left? Helen's face became serious again. Only after one condition had been met. What condition? You had to be completely free from your family's control. I stared at her. I'm sorry. What? Eleanor was very specific. No, that's impossible. It isn't. My family loved me. Helen didn't argue, she simply waited. They may have had problems, I continued, almost defending them out of habit. But my grandmother wouldn't have said something like that. Grace. Her voice was gentle. Do you remember exactly how your grandmother phrased things when you were 10 years old? I opened my mouth, then stopped. No. I remembered pieces. Her hugs, the smell of cinnamon in her kitchen, an old rocking chair, apple pie cooling by the window, but conversations? Almost none. Helen noticed the realization on my face. Memories fade. I nodded slowly. They do. Eleanor knew they would. I rubbed my forehead. So she predicted this? I don't believe she predicted everything. What then? I think she understood people. That answer somehow felt even heavier. Helen continued carefully. She believed that as long as you depended entirely on your family, you would never truly be free to make your own decisions. I thought about the last 2 years, moving home, handing over my paychecks, planning my schedule around everyone else's needs, convincing myself it was temporary. Maybe. I hadn't noticed how small my own life had become. I loved taking care of my mother, I said quietly. I believe you. I don't regret helping her. You shouldn't. Helen leaned forward. Kindness isn't the mistake. I looked at her. Forgetting to protect yourself is. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The shelter had grown quieter. Someone dimmed the lights in the fellowship hall, and I could hear volunteers stacking chairs in the distance. Finally, I asked the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind. If my grandmother planned all of this. Helen nodded. Then what exactly did she leave me? Instead of answering, Helen slowly reached down beside her chair. There was a small canvas tote resting against the wall. I hadn't noticed it before. She lifted it carefully onto her lap and loosened the zipper. Then she reached inside with both hands. When she looked back at me, her eyes were filled with something between relief and sadness. I've protected this for almost 20 years, she whispered. A moment later, she gently placed an old wooden box between us. The box was smaller than I expected. Dark walnut wood, worn edges, a brass clasp polished smooth with age. I reached for it, then stopped. Go ahead, Helen said gently. I lifted the lid. Inside was a bundle of envelopes tied with a faded blue ribbon. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then I saw my name. Grace Sullivan. The handwriting was unmistakable. My grandmother's. My breath caught in my throat. I picked up the first envelope. The paper had yellowed with age and a bright red stamp stretched across the front. Return to sender. I grabbed another. Same stamp. Then another. And another. Every single envelope had been sent back. How many are there? I whispered. 68. I stared at the stack. She mailed all of these to me? Helen nodded. She did. But I never received any of them. I know. Carefully, I untied the ribbon and spread several letters across the bench. The postmarks covered years, birthdays, Christmases, summer vacations, ordinary Tuesdays. She had been writing to me almost my entire childhood. I looked at Helen. Who sent them back? She hesitated for only a moment. Your mother. My heart dropped. No. I'm sorry, Grace. There has to be some mistake. There isn't. I turned one envelope over. Across the back flap was handwriting I recognized instantly. My mother's. She had written 2 simple words. Return to sender. I stared until the ink blurred. That handwriting had signed my report cards, birthday cards, permission slips. I'd seen it thousands of times. Why would she do this? Helen sighed. Eleanor believed your mother didn't want the 2 of you to stay close. I shook my head. My mom always told me Grandma stopped writing because she was getting forgetful. Helen's expression was full of quiet sadness. Eleanor never stopped. I carefully opened the oldest letter. The paper crackled between my fingers. Dear Gracie, I heard you won your spelling bee. I wish I could have been there to cheer for you. My eyes burned. I remembered that day. I'd waited by the phone, hoping Grandma would call. She never did. Or at least, that's what I'd believed. I opened another letter. I baked your favorite apple pie today. I hope one day we'll bake it together again. Another. I hope your scraped knee is healing. Please be careful on that bicycle. Tiny moments. Ordinary memories. She knew what was happening in my life. She had been trying to stay part of it. I thought she forgot me, I whispered. Helen gently shook her head. She never forgot you. I looked at the stack again. 68 letters. 68 chances to hear my grandmother's voice. 68 chances that had been taken away. For the first time, I realized my childhood hadn't simply faded with time. Parts of it had been deliberately kept from me. I wiped away my tears. I don't even know what to believe anymore. You don't have to figure it out tonight, Helen said softly. Just know this. Your grandmother loved you until her very last day. She carefully gathered the letters and placed them back inside the box. Then she looked at me. These aren't the only things Eleanor left behind. I frowned. What do you mean? She closed the lid and rested one hand on the box. The rest has been kept by the attorney who handled your grandmother's estate. I looked at her, confused. There's more? Helen nodded. And I think it's time for you to meet him. I barely slept that night. Not because the shelter was noisy. It wasn't. My mind just refused to slow down. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those 68 letters spread across the bench. I kept wondering what my life would have looked like if even one of them had reached me. The next morning, Helen found me in the dining hall while I was helping serve breakfast. You still want answers? She asked. I nodded without hesitation. An hour later, we pulled into a quiet part of town. The law office wasn't impressive. It was an older brick building with a brass plaque beside the entrance, Whitaker and Associates. Helen smiled when she noticed me staring at it. This place has been here longer than either of us. Inside, everything felt frozen in time. Wooden bookshelves, framed certificates, the faint smell of old paper and coffee. A receptionist looked up and smiled. He'll see you now. Helen led me into a corner office where an elderly man slowly stood from behind his desk. His hair was completely white, but his eyes were sharp. You must be Grace Sullivan. I am. He reached out his hand. I'm Robert Whitaker. His handshake was firm. I've hoped we'd meet someday. I laughed nervously. That's the second time I've heard that in less than 24 hours. He smiled. I suppose it is. Robert invited us to sit before opening a locked filing cabinet. Instead of pulling out one folder, he removed an old leather portfolio. He placed it carefully on the desk. I've kept this exactly as your grandmother instructed. My heartbeat sped up. You really knew her? For almost 30 years. He opened the portfolio and slid several documents toward me. Across the top of the first page were the words, The Eleanor Sullivan Family Trust. I looked from the papers to Robert. I've never heard of this. I'm not surprised. He adjusted his glasses. Very few people did. He slowly explained that years before her death, my grandmother had created a private trust separate from the rest of her estate. Most of her belongings had gone through the normal probate process, but not everything. There were a few assets she chose to protect. What kind of assets? I asked. Robert turned another page. A small mountain cottage surrounded by an old apple orchard. I blinked. My grandmother owned another house? She did. I never knew. There was also a savings account. He slid another document toward me. The balance isn't enormous, but Eleanor preserved it carefully. I stared at the paperwork. It didn't make sense. My family never mentioned any of this. Robert exchanged a quiet glance with Helen. They weren't supposed to. I looked back down. The cottage, the savings, the trust. For years, I'd believed my grandmother had left behind very little. Now I was learning she'd planned something entirely different. Without realizing it, I smiled. Not because of the money, because for the first time in days, I felt wanted. It was as if my grandmother had reached across 20 years just to remind me I hadn't been forgotten. I swallowed the lump in my throat. She really thought about me. Robert nodded. Every detail. He turned to the final page. However, the smile faded from my face. There is one condition. I looked at him. What kind of condition? Robert rested one finger on a single paragraph near the bottom of the document. Eleanor was very clear. He slowly pushed the trust agreement across the desk until it stopped in front of me. I think you should read this part yourself. Grace followed Margaret's car through a winding mountain road I had never driven before. The farther we got from the city, the quieter everything became. The traffic disappeared. Cell service faded in and out. Tall apple trees lined both sides of the road, their branches almost bare in the cold November air. "You've never been here?" Margaret asked. I shook my head. If my grandmother owned a place like this, why didn't anyone ever tell me? Margaret kept her eyes on the road. Because some people only mention what benefits them. That answer stayed with me for the rest of the drive. A few minutes later, she slowed in front of a simple white cottage sitting at the edge of a small orchard. It wasn't a mansion, it wasn't even a large house, but it looked loved. A wooden porch wrapped around the front. Wind chimes moved softly in the breeze. The mailbox leaned slightly to one side, and someone had recently swept the front steps. I stared through the windshield without moving. "This is yours now," Margaret said quietly. I laughed once, almost by accident. "No, there has to be some mistake." "There isn't." She handed me a small brass key. My fingers hesitated before taking it. I walked toward the front door like I was afraid the whole place would disappear if I moved too fast. The lock turned smoothly. The door opened with a gentle creak. The first thing I noticed wasn't the furniture. It was the smell. Fresh cedar, old books, cinnamon, and something that reminded me of homemade apple pie. I closed my eyes. For one strange second, I felt like I was 8 years old again. The living room looked untouched. A knitted blanket rested neatly over the couch. Family photographs filled the shelves. An old record player sat beside the fireplace. Nothing looked abandoned. It felt as if my grandmother had simply stepped outside and would be back any minute. I slowly walked through the house. Every room carried little pieces of her. Pressed flowers inside picture frames, handwritten recipe cards in the kitchen, a pair of reading glasses resting beside a favorite chair. Margaret smiled as she watched me look around. "I've had someone maintain the property all these years," she said. "Your grandmother wanted it preserved exactly as she left it." "For me? For you?" I ran my hand across the dining table. There wasn't a layer of dust anywhere. Someone had cared for this place with incredible patience. Tears threatened again, but this time they weren't coming from grief. They came from relief. For nearly a week I'd been living out of suitcases. I'd slept in my car, then at a church shelter. I'd started believing I didn't belong anywhere anymore. Yet somehow, my grandmother had prepared a home for me years before I ever knew I'd need one. Margaret gave me space while I wandered through the bedrooms. One room still held a quilt covered in tiny apple blossoms. Another contained shelves full of gardening books. Then I opened a closet. Inside hung one old blue cardigan. I remembered it instantly. She used to wear it whenever we baked together. Without thinking, I slipped it over my shoulders. It was slightly oversized. It still carried the faint scent of lavender. Margaret looked at me and quietly wiped away a tear of her own. She would have loved seeing that. Neither of us spoke for a while. Words suddenly felt unnecessary. Eventually, Margaret checked her watch. "I should let you settle in." I walked her to the front porch. "Thank you," I said. She smiled gently. "Don't thank me." She looked back at the house. "Thank the woman who believed you'd find your way here." After her car disappeared down the road, silence settled over the orchard. It wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. For the first time since my brother had slammed that front door in my face, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was looking at what had somehow been waiting for me all along. I went back inside and wandered into the kitchen. A bowl of polished red apples sat in the center of the table. Beside it rested a single cream-colored envelope. My name was written across the front in familiar handwriting. Grace. My heart skipped. I reached for it carefully. Underneath, someone had written one more sentence. "Please read this only after you've finally come home." My hands trembled as I picked up the envelope. For a long moment, I simply stared at my name. The handwriting was unmistakable. Every birthday card, every Christmas gift tag, every little note tucked inside my lunchbox when I was a kid. It was hers. I carefully unfolded the letter, afraid the paper might fall apart. "My dearest Grace, if you're reading this, then you've finally arrived here on your own. That means something painful has already happened. I prayed it never would. But I knew the people around you better than you did." I had to stop reading. My throat tightened. She had written this years before she passed away. Yet it felt like she was sitting across the table, speaking directly to me. I took a slow breath and continued. "You have always believed that love means giving until there's nothing left. You learned that from watching your mother. But you did not learn what she forgot. Real love also protects itself." I stared at those words. They landed harder than I expected. For 2 years, I had convinced myself sacrifice was simply part of loving someone. Working fewer hours, giving up my apartment, emptying my savings, driving mom to dialysis before sunrise, skipping vacations, missing birthdays. None of it had felt like a burden, because I believed we were carrying it together. Now I wasn't so sure. The next paragraph made me grip the paper tighter. "One day they may ask you for everything, not because they need all of it, but because you've never learned to say no. If that day comes, I hope this house reminds you that you deserve a place where nothing has to be earned." A tear landed on the page. I quickly wiped it away before the ink could smear. My grandmother hadn't written about money. She hadn't warned me about a specific betrayal. She had understood something much deeper. She knew my weakness. I had spent my entire life trying to become useful enough that nobody would stop loving me. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Outside, I could hear the wind moving through the apple trees. For the first time in days, the silence wasn't frightening. It felt safe. I finished the letter slowly. Don't waste your heart trying to convince people to value it. The people who truly love you never ask you to prove your worth. Build a peaceful life. Plant new trees. Bake the pie we always made together. Open your door to kind people. And never mistake guilt for responsibility. I will always love you. Grandma. I lowered the letter into my lap. I didn't cry the way I had outside my old house. Those tears had come from shock. These came from finally feeling understood. Nobody had ever described me so honestly, not even me. I looked around the kitchen again. The wooden table, the old pie dish hanging near the stove, the faded curtains over the window. She hadn't left me luxury. She had left me peace. That realization changed something inside me. For the first time since my brother shut the door in my face, I stopped thinking about getting my old life back. Maybe I didn't want it back anymore. Margaret knocked softly before stepping inside. "I didn't want to interrupt," she said. "I just wanted to make sure you were all right." I smiled through damp eyes. "I think I'm finally starting to be." She glanced at the letter. "She always hoped you'd understand it when the time was right." "I do now." Margaret squeezed my shoulder before quietly leaving again. I remained at the table until the afternoon sunlight stretched across the floor. Then I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into its envelope. Instead of placing it in a drawer, I carried it upstairs and set it on the nightstand beside the bed. It wasn't something I wanted to hide. It was something I wanted to remember every morning. I walked back outside onto the porch. Rows of apple trees stretched across the property. Some needed pruning. The fence leaned in a few places. The paint on the porch rail was beginning to peel. There was work to do. For the first time in a long while, that thought didn't exhaust me. It gave me purpose. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and opened the job listings for rehabilitation hospitals in the nearest town. Then I quietly said to myself, "All right, Grandma. I'm staying." The first morning I woke up in my grandmother's house, I forgot where I was. For a split second, I expected to hear my brother arguing on the phone downstairs, or my mother's television playing too loudly. Instead, I heard birds, then the wind moving through the apple trees. I smiled before I even opened my eyes. It felt strange. Not because I was happy, because I had finally slept through the night. I made coffee using my grandmother's old percolator. It took longer than the machine I'd owned before, but somehow I didn't mind. While it brewed, I walked onto the porch with a notebook and started making a list. Call the insurance company, find a mechanic for my car, update my address, apply for nearby hospitals, buy groceries. For the first time in weeks, my list wasn't about surviving, it was about living. My savings weren't impressive anymore, but the small trust my grandmother had left was enough to give me breathing room. I didn't have to panic over every dollar. That alone felt like a miracle. A few days later, I interviewed at a rehabilitation hospital about 30 minutes away. The director looked over my resume, then looked back at me. "You've been an occupational therapist for over 10 years?" "Almost 11. "And you reduced your hours voluntarily?" I nodded. "My mother became seriously ill. She needed someone with her." He didn't ask any more questions. At the end of the interview, he stood up and offered his hand. "We'd be lucky to have someone with your experience." I accepted the position before I reached the parking lot. Driving home that afternoon, I caught myself singing along with the radio. I couldn't remember the last time I'd done that. Work settled into a comfortable rhythm. The hospital wasn't as large as my old one, but everyone knew each other. Nurses introduced themselves on my first day. Therapists invited me to lunch instead of letting me eat alone. No one treated me like the person who always had to carry everything. I was simply Grace. That felt refreshing. Whenever I had a free afternoon, I worked around the house. I painted the porch railing, fixed a loose kitchen cabinet, trimmed dead branches from a few apple trees, with help from a neighbor who refused to let me struggle alone. "You'll get better fruit next season," he said. "I'll hold you to that," I laughed. Margaret visited almost every Sunday. Sometimes she brought homemade soup, sometimes old photographs she'd found in storage. Other times she simply sat on the porch with me while we watched the sunset. We didn't always need long conversations. Comfort had quietly replaced awkwardness. One afternoon she handed me a faded recipe card. "Your grandmother always said nobody made her apple pie quite like you." I laughed. "I was 10. She did all the work." Margaret grinned. That's not how she remembered it. We spent the afternoon baking together, the kitchen filled with cinnamon and baked apples, just like the day I'd first walked into the house. For the first time in years, Thanksgiving didn't feel like something I had lost. It felt like something I could rebuild. That evening, I carried 2 slices of pie next door to thank the neighbor who'd helped with the orchard. He smiled. Looks like this place finally has someone home again. Those simple words stayed with me all the way back. Someone home again? Maybe that was true. Maybe this house had been waiting just as patiently as my grandmother had. Life wasn't perfect. I still thought about my mother. I still wondered if she'd ever call. Sometimes I caught myself reaching for my phone before remembering there were no messages. But the hurt no longer controlled every hour of my day. I was learning something new. Healing wasn't one big moment. It was hundreds of ordinary days that slowly stopped hurting. I had just finished washing the pie dishes when my phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. An unfamiliar number flashed across the screen. I almost ignored it. Then voicemail didn't pick up. The phone kept ringing. Curious, I answered. Hello? There was a brief silence. Then I heard a voice I hadn't heard since the locks changed. Grace. It was my mother. I froze with the phone against my ear. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then my mother cleared her throat. How have you been? It was such a normal question that it almost made me laugh. I looked around the kitchen, the pie cooling on the counter, the afternoon sunlight coming through the window. The house she didn't even know existed. I've been all right, I answered carefully. I'm glad to hear that. Another pause. She sounded softer than I remembered. Not weak. Just careful. I've been worried about you. Those words stung more than I expected. Worried? I asked quietly. You changed the locks before I came home. She didn't answer right away. I know things happened that shouldn't have happened. I waited. Nothing else came. No apology, no explanation. Just silence. She changed the subject instead. Are you still working? I found a new position. That's good. The conversation felt awkward, like two strangers trying to remember how they used to know each other. For a moment, I almost believed we could rebuild something. She asked if I was eating well. She reminded me to wear a heavier coat because winter was coming. It sounded so familiar that I caught myself relaxing. Then her voice shifted. I heard, you inherited something from your grandmother. There it was. I closed my eyes. Who told you that? People talk. Mom. I'm just asking. No. You don't have to get defensive. I'm asking who told you. She ignored the question. I heard it's a nice property. I didn't respond. You know how expensive my treatments have become. I know. If your grandmother left you a house, she continued carefully, maybe we should sit down as a family and discuss what makes the most sense. The warmth disappeared from her voice. Not completely. Just enough for me to recognize the pattern. Every conversation eventually became about responsibility, about what I could give, about what I owed. I rested one hand on the kitchen table. Have you called because you miss me? I do. Or because of the house? She hesitated. Only for a second. But it was enough. Grace, don't make this difficult. I let out a slow breath. I've spent most of my life making things easier for everyone else. You've always been stubborn. That almost made me smile. Growing up, I was never called stubborn when I agreed. Only when I finally disagreed. I have to go, I said. You'll think about what I said? I'll think about everything. I ended the call before either of us could say something we'd regret. The kitchen suddenly felt quieter than before. I wasn't crying. I wasn't angry. Mostly, I felt disappointed. Part of me had answered that phone hoping to hear my mother say she'd made a terrible mistake. Instead, she'd confirmed what my grandmother had tried to warn me about years ago. Love wasn't supposed to come with negotiations. I carried my coffee onto the porch and sat there until sunset. Margaret stopped by later that evening with fresh bread she'd baked. One look at my face and she asked, "She called." I nodded. "How did you know?" You have your grandmother's expression whenever someone breaks your heart. I laughed softly. Is it that obvious? Only to people who care. That sentence stayed with me long after she went home. The next afternoon, my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't my mother. The screen showed a name I hadn't seen in months. Rachel. My cousin. I answered cautiously. Grace? Yeah, please don't hang up. Her voice was low, almost nervous. I need to tell you something, but I can't do it over the phone. I frowned. What is it? Can we meet somewhere? Why all the secrecy? She lowered her voice even further. Because if your brother finds out I contacted you, he'll never forgive me. Rachel chose a small coffee shop halfway between my town and hers. She was already sitting in the back corner when I walked in, constantly glancing toward the windows like she expected someone to recognize her. When she saw me, she stood up. Thanks for coming. You sounded nervous. I am. We ordered coffee, but neither of us touched it. Rachel kept twisting the paper sleeve around her cup. Finally, she looked at me. I owe you an apology. For what? I knew they were treating you unfairly. My chest tightened. But I didn't know how bad it really was until after you left. I stayed quiet. She took a deep breath. Grace, your brother told everyone you moved out because you wanted your freedom back. I let out a short, bitter laugh. I came home after a 13-hour shift to change locks. I know. So why didn't anyone call me? Rachel looked down. Because most of the family believed him. That hurt more than I wanted to admit. She reached into her purse and pulled out several folded papers. I wasn't supposed to see these. They were copies of public property records. The house sold almost 3 weeks before you came home. I frowned. They told me it had just happened. Rachel shook her head. No, everything had already been finalized. I stared at the paperwork. So they knew. They knew. A heavy silence settled between us. Rachel spoke again. There's something else. I looked up. Your family wasn't doing well financially. I figured that much. No, worse than you think. She explained that my brother had borrowed against the house several times over the past few years. Credit card debt, business loans that never worked out, medical bills that insurance didn't fully cover. Eventually, there was no way to keep up. Selling the house became the only option. I listened without interrupting. None of it explained why I had been thrown out. Rachel seemed to read my mind. They needed the sale money. I understand that. She swallowed hard. But once your paycheck stopped going into the joint account, my stomach dropped. They couldn't cover the monthly expenses anymore. I looked at her without speaking. They were already planning to sell, she continued quietly. But after you opened your own account, everything started falling apart faster. The words landed harder than I expected. For 2 years, I believed I had been helping my mother recover. Now I realized I'd also been keeping the entire household afloat without even knowing it. Rachel's eyes filled with regret. I'm sorry. They didn't throw me out because they didn't have room. She slowly shook her head. They threw you out because you weren't paying for everyone anymore. I leaned back in my chair. Oddly enough, I didn't feel like crying. The truth was ugly, but it was finally honest. Rachel reached across the table. I should have warned you. You weren't the one who packed my life into cardboard boxes. No, but I stayed quiet. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I squeezed her hand. You're talking now. That was enough. She gave me a small, relieved smile. I'm trying. We talked for another hour. Not about money, about childhood memories, about Grandma, about how different everything felt after she was gone. When we stood to leave, Rachel hesitated. One more thing. What is it? My aunt, she said carefully, meaning my mother, wants the family together next weekend. I frowned. For what? They're having dinner. I'm not exactly welcome. Rachel gave me a knowing look. They're making it sound like a reconciliation. And you don't believe that? No. She pulled a folded invitation from her purse. My brother asked me to give this to you personally. I unfolded the card. Family dinner. Sunday, 6 p.m. At the bottom, someone had handwritten one sentence. We need to discuss your grandmother's property. Grace's invitation sat on my kitchen counter for almost 2 days before I finally picked it up again. I must have read the same 3 lines 20 times. Family dinner. Sunday. Mom would like everyone together. No apology. No explanation. Just an address and a time. Margaret looked up from the flowers she was trimming on the back porch. You're thinking about going. I am. You don't have to. I know. I folded the card in half. But if I don't go, I'll always wonder what they wanted. She nodded slowly. Just remember, Grace, kindness and sincerity aren't always the same thing. That sentence stayed with me all morning. I wasn't expecting a miracle. I wasn't walking in hoping my family would suddenly hug me and admit they were wrong. I just wanted answers. Before leaving, I slipped copies of my trust documents into a folder and locked them in my desk drawer. I wasn't planning to bring anything valuable with me. Something told me to be careful. The drive to my mother's temporary rental house felt strangely familiar. Same neighborhood. Same grocery store on the corner. Same coffee shop where I'd stopped countless mornings before work. Everything looked normal. My life certainly didn't. When I parked outside, several cars were already in the driveway. My cousin Daniel noticed me first. You came, he said quietly. I almost didn't. I'm glad you did. His expression wasn't cheerful. It was concerned. That alone made me more cautious. The front door opened before I reached it. My mother stood there. For just a second, neither of us spoke. She looked healthier than the last time I'd seen her. Color had returned to her face. She'd even styled her hair. Grace, she said softly. Hi, Mom. She hesitated before stepping aside. Come in. No hug. But at least she hadn't shut the door this time. Inside, everything smelled like roasted turkey and fresh bread. It almost reminded me of Thanksgivings from years ago. My aunt waved from the dining room. There she is. Someone else smiled. Another cousin asked how work was going. My brother Ethan even walked over carrying 2 glasses. Want some iced tea? I blinked. Was this really the same man who had thrown my belongings onto the lawn? Sure. He handed me the glass with an easy smile. No hard feelings today, okay? Mom just wanted everyone together. His tone was so casual it almost made me question my own memory. Almost. Dinner hadn't started yet, so people gathered around the living room talking about football, holiday shopping, and neighborhood gossip. No one mentioned the house. No one mentioned the locks. No one mentioned that I had spent nights sleeping in a church shelter. It was as if those weeks had never happened. Mom even asked, "How's your new job?" It's going well. I'm glad. That was it. No apology, no acknowledgement, just small talk. It felt strangely rehearsed. Daniel caught my eye from across the room and gave the slightest shake of his head. Stay alert. As dinner was served, everyone complimented the food. For nearly an hour, the conversation stayed surprisingly light. My aunt laughed about burning a pie. One cousin teased another over fantasy football. Mom smiled more than I'd seen in years. If someone had walked into the room without knowing our history, they would have thought we were a perfectly normal family. I almost hated how comforting it felt. Part of me wanted to believe this dinner meant something. Maybe losing me had changed them. Maybe... So, Ethan leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. The room grew quieter. I've been meaning to talk to everyone about property values. There it was. The warmth I'd been feeling instantly cooled. He reached beside his chair and picked up a large manila envelope. I had an appraisal done? He slid several papers onto the table. The first page had a professional real estate company's logo across the top. Then he looked directly at me. I think you'll want to see these. My fingers tightened around my glass as Ethan slowly turned the appraisal toward the center of the table. The appraisal packet stopped in front of me. I glanced at the first page without touching it. The estimated market value of my grandmother's cottage was much higher than I'd imagined. The housing market had changed dramatically over the years. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then Ethan smiled. So, good news. I looked up. Good news for who? He ignored the question. You've probably noticed the property is worth a lot more than when Grandma bought it. I noticed the number. He nodded like we were having a normal business discussion. Exactly. Which means we have an opportunity. There it was. Not an apology, not an explanation. An opportunity. Mom cleared her throat. Grace, sweetheart, just hear him out. I leaned back in my chair but didn't say anything. Ethan slid another paper toward me. We've already talked with a realtor. If the cottage goes on the market this season, we could get an excellent offer. We? Our family. The word sounded strangely forced. I folded my hands together. I don't remember asking anyone to contact a realtor. You didn't have to. He shrugged. We're trying to help. Daniel lowered his eyes. He already knew where this conversation was headed. One of my aunts spoke next. Honey, that little house is old. It needs repairs. Selling it now makes more sense than pouring money into it. Another uncle nodded. You could invest the money instead. You deserve a fresh start. Every sentence sounded reasonable by itself. Together they felt rehearsed. I looked around the table. No one seemed surprised. No one interrupted. They'd clearly discussed this before inviting me. Mom finally reached across the table. Grace, we're worried about you. I couldn't help asking. Worried enough to throw me out without warning? Silence. She slowly pulled her hand back. That wasn't handled well. That's one way to describe it. Ethan sighed dramatically. We're not here to relive the past. No, I said quietly. You're here because of the house. His jaw tightened. We're here because we're family. I almost laughed. When I was sleeping in my car, where was this family? Nobody answered. An awkward silence settled over the table. Someone shifted in their chair. Another person stared down at their plate. Finally, Ethan spoke again. Look, nobody's saying we handled everything perfectly. But this isn't about emotions anymore. It's about making smart financial decisions. There it is. He frowned. What? The real reason. Mom looked exhausted. Grace, please don't make this harder than it has to be. I'm making it harder? You're holding on to a house you don't need. I took a slow breath. I live there. You could buy something newer. I don't want something newer. It's just a building. No, I answered. It isn't. Margaret's words echoed in my head. Kindness and sincerity aren't always the same thing. My grandmother hadn't left me that cottage because it was valuable. She left it because it was home. The place where I'd spent summers baking pies with her. Where she'd taught me how to plant tomatoes. Where she'd told me stories while rain tapped against the porch roof. They saw square footage. I saw memories. Ethan noticed my expression and changed tactics. What if we split the money? I blinked. What? The whole family could benefit. There it is, Daniel muttered under his breath. Everyone looked at him. He immediately focused on his drink. Ethan continued as if nothing had happened. You've already received more than anyone else. It was Grandma's decision. And we're respecting that. No, I said calmly. You're trying to undo it. Mom's voice cracked. Grace, please. For what? So we can stay together. I looked around the room one more time. The smiles were gone. The warmth from earlier had completely disappeared. Every face was waiting. Not for reconciliation, for my answer. I pushed the appraisal papers back across the table without even looking at the last page. Ethan's smile faded. So? I met his eyes. No. The room went completely silent. The word lingered in the dining room longer than I expected. Ethan stared at me, waiting for me to change my mind. I didn't. He leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. You're serious? I am. Mom looked down at her plate. Grace. I've listened to everyone. Now it's my turn. No one interrupted. I kept my voice calm. If this is really about your medical care, then let's go over the numbers. Ethan frowned. What numbers? The actual expenses. I turned to Mom. You have Medicare. She nodded reluctantly. You also have the supplemental insurance Margaret helped you review last month. Another small nod. And because of your condition, you qualified for the state assistance program. Silence. I continued. Most of your dialysis treatments are already covered. One of my uncles shifted uncomfortably. I looked back at Mom. Your medications are covered too, except for a small monthly copay. She quietly admitted. Mostly. I folded my hands together. So why exactly does my grandmother's house need to be sold? Nobody answered immediately. Ethan finally spoke. There are always unexpected costs. I know, I'm an occupational therapist. I work with patients managing chronic illnesses every day. He looked irritated. I'm saying there are other ways. There are. I'll help pay whatever isn't covered. Mom looked surprised. I've already started rebuilding my savings. I have a steady job again. I paused before adding, I never stopped wanting to help you. The room became uncomfortably quiet. For the first time that evening, a few relatives avoided looking at Ethan. He tapped the appraisal papers with one finger. That's generous, but selling the house still makes more sense. For who? For everyone. No, I answered. For everyone who wants cash. His expression hardened. You've changed. I have. You've become selfish. That word hit harder than I expected. Selfish. After giving up my apartment, after working 13-hour shifts, after spending nearly all my income helping Mom. Selfish. I let out a quiet laugh I couldn't quite control. You know what's strange? Nobody spoke. I never heard that word while my paychecks were going into the family account. Ethan's jaw tightened. Don't start that again. I'm not starting anything. I'm remembering. One of my aunts suddenly crossed her arms. Families make sacrifices. I did. We all did. Did you? The question hung in the air. Another uncle sighed loudly. This isn't productive. No, I agreed. Because no one is answering the question. Mom finally looked at me. I don't want us fighting. I don't either. Then why can't you let this go? I met her eyes. Because Grandma didn't. She blinked. What? She protected that house for a reason. Nobody had a response. Daniel quietly pushed his chair back. I need some air. He walked toward the back porch without waiting for permission. A minute later, I excused myself too. I'll be right back. No one tried to stop me. The cold evening air felt like a relief. Daniel was standing by the porch railing with his hands in his pockets. You okay? He asked. I will be. He nodded. I figured. For a few seconds we just listened to the wind moving through the trees. Then he spoke again. Much quieter. Grace. What? There's something you should know. I looked at him. This didn't start with Ethan. My stomach tightened. What do you mean? He rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. I've heard stories. Things about your mom. Stuff that happened years before you moved back home. I frowned. What stories? Daniel hesitated. I don't think she ever told you what happened after your grandmother changed her will. Daniel stayed quiet for a few seconds, like he was deciding how much he should say. I wasn't even supposed to know this, he admitted. I only heard bits and pieces growing up. I crossed my arms against the cold. Just tell me. He nodded. Your mom wasn't always like this. I frowned. What do you mean? When she was about your age, she had plans to leave town. I blinked. Leave? She wanted to go back to school. I think it was nursing, maybe hospital administration. Everyone remembers it differently. That caught me off guard. My mother had never talked about wanting another life. Daniel continued. Grandma got sick around that time. I already knew where this was going. The family asked your mom to stay. Asked? He gave me a sad smile. From what I've heard, it didn't feel like a request. The wind rustled through the trees behind us. She gave everything up, he said. School, a job opportunity in another city, even someone she was dating. I looked back toward the dining room window. Mom was inside, clearing plates with my aunt as if nothing serious had happened. I never knew. I don't think she wanted anyone to know. Daniel leaned against the porch railing. The family praised her for making the sacrifice. I let out a slow breath. And then? Years passed. Did anyone ever help her? He shook his head. Not really. The answer hurt more than I expected. For the first time in weeks, I saw something besides anger when I looked at my mother. I saw someone who had spent years believing that love meant giving up pieces of yourself. Someone had taught her that. Someone had convinced her sacrifice was the only way to belong. It explained so much, but it didn't erase what she'd done. Daniel seemed to read my expression. You feel bad for her. I do. And? I looked him in the eye. It doesn't change what happened. He nodded immediately. I know. I understand why she became this way. I swallowed. But understanding isn't the same as excusing it. Daniel smiled faintly. I was hoping you'd say that. We stood there for another minute before heading back inside. Dinner ended politely. Too politely. People avoided another argument. My mother hugged a few relatives goodbye. When it was my turn, she hesitated. I'll call you. I hope you do. Neither of us moved closer. I left without another word. The drive home felt strangely peaceful, not because anything had been fixed, because something inside me had. I finally understood that my mother's pain hadn't started with me. It had simply reached me. That realization made me sad. It didn't make me willing to lose myself. The following afternoon, I sat at my grandmother's kitchen table. For hours, I wrote a letter to Mom. Not to argue, not to accuse. I told her I finally understood some of her past. I thanked her for the years she had spent raising us. I admitted I still loved her. But I also told her I would never sell Grandma's house, and I would never allow guilt to decide my future again. When I finished, I felt lighter than I had in months. I sealed the envelope myself and drove to the post office before I could change my mind. Whatever happened next, at least she would know exactly how I felt. 3 days later, I found an envelope resting inside my mailbox. It was mine. The same stamp, the same handwriting. Across the front, a bright postal sticker covered the corner. Return to sender. Refused. Unopened. The envelope stayed on my kitchen table all evening. I didn't open it again. There was no point. The words stamped across the front had already said everything my mother chose not to. Refused. Unopened. Margaret stopped by the next morning with fresh muffins from the bakery. She noticed the envelope immediately. Bad news? I handed it to her. She read the sticker, sighed, and placed it back on the table. I'm sorry. I think I was more disappointed than surprised. She reached over and squeezed my hand. You gave her a chance. I know. And that's all anyone can do. Life slowly settled into a routine again. Work kept me busy. The cottage needed constant attention. One weekend I repaired a loose porch step. The next I painted the old fence with help from a neighbor who refused to let me do it alone. You'll owe me pie, he joked. I can manage pie. Those small moments reminded me that family wasn't always determined by blood. Sometimes it was simply the people who showed up. About 3 weeks later, my phone rang while I was finishing paperwork at the clinic. Daniel. I answered immediately. Hey, everything okay? There was a long pause. It's Aunt Linda. My stomach tightened. What happened? She collapsed this morning. I frowned. I thought Mom had been doing better. So did everyone. He lowered his voice. The doctors think her kidneys have gotten worse again. For a moment I couldn't say anything. Every disagreement, every hurt, none of it erased the fact that she was still my mother. When are they admitting her? She's already at St. Matthew's. I'll come after work. You don't have to. I know. But I was already grabbing my car keys. The hospital felt painfully familiar. I'd walked those same hallways hundreds of times over the past 2 years. The smell of disinfectant, the steady rhythm of monitors, families waiting for answers. Some things never changed. When I reached the waiting area, everyone looked up. Conversations stopped. My aunt stood first. Grace. Her voice sounded almost relieved. Mom was still in testing, so only the family remained in the lounge. Even Ethan looked exhausted. He hadn't shaved. Dark circles sat under his eyes. For a second, he looked less like my brother and more like someone who hadn't slept in days. We're glad you came, he said quietly. It was strange hearing those words from him. How is she? They're still evaluating her. I nodded. No one argued. No one mentioned the cottage. For nearly 20 minutes, we simply waited. Eventually, a nephrologist came out and explained that Mom would need closer monitoring and more support once she was discharged. As the doctor walked away, the silence returned. Then Ethan spoke. We've been talking. I looked at him carefully. About what? We can't do this alone anymore. No surprise there. He rubbed his forehead. Mom needs someone with medical experience. I already knew where this was heading. My aunt added gently, She trusts you. Another relative nodded. You always knew what medications she needed. You understand the equipment. You've done this before. One by one, they built the same argument, different words, same destination. Finally, Ethan looked directly at me. You should move back in. The waiting room went completely still. I don't think that's a good idea. It would only be until Mom gets stronger. We'd all help this time. I almost smiled. I'd heard promises before. Things would be different, my aunt insisted. How? Nobody answered immediately. I took a slow breath. I'll help Mom. Several faces brightened. But I'm not moving back into anyone's house. The expressions around the room shifted. Confusion, disappointment, a little frustration. I continued before anyone could interrupt. I'll coordinate therapy if she needs it. I'll explain medications. I'll attend appointments if Mom wants me there. But I'm not giving up my home. Ethan opened his mouth to argue. Before he could speak, a nurse appeared. The physician would like to meet with the immediate family in the consultation room. Everyone stood. Without realizing it, the entire family turned toward me at the same time. Every pair of eyes was waiting for my decision before anyone took a single step. Every pair of eyes stayed on me as we walked into the consultation room. The doctor introduced himself, reviewed my mother's latest lab results, and explained that while she was stable, her condition had progressed. She'll need consistent follow-up, he said, medication management, transportation to appointments, and someone who can recognize changes before they become emergencies. I listened carefully. Nothing he said surprised me. I'd spent years helping patients and their families navigate exactly these situations. When he finished, he asked, "Does your family have a caregiving plan?" The room went silent. Then Ethan looked at me. "We were hoping Grace could move back in." The doctor glanced between us. "I see." I spoke before anyone else could. "I'd like to clarify something." The doctor nodded. "I'm happy to help coordinate her care." I pulled out a notepad from my purse almost out of habit. "I can organize appointments, communicate with specialists, review discharge instructions, and make sure everyone understands the treatment plan." The doctor smiled. "That would be very helpful," I continued. "I can also recommend home modifications if they're needed. That's part of what I do professionally." Mom finally spoke. "So you'll come home?" I looked at her gently. "No." The room became quiet again. "I won't be moving back." Ethan let out an irritated sigh. "Grace." I raised a hand. "I'm not finished." I kept my voice calm. "I'll visit. I'll answer medical questions. I'll be available during emergencies if I'm able. But I won't be your full-time caregiver." My aunt frowned. "Why not?" "Because I already did that." Nobody responded. "I gave 2 years of my life willingly." I looked around the room. "And I don't regret caring for Mom." That part was true. I regret believing that my life no longer mattered. The words landed harder than I'd intended. One uncle shook his head. "Families don't keep score." "I'm not keeping score." "What are you doing then?" "I'm setting boundaries." Ethan laughed once without humor. "That's what people say when they stop caring." "No." I met his eyes. "It's what people say when they finally start caring about themselves too." The doctor quietly excused himself, sensing this was no longer a medical discussion. As soon as the door closed, Ethan stood. "So, that's it?" "No. I've offered real help." "You've offered convenience." His face hardened. "We all have jobs." "So do I." "We have kids." "I understand." "You have a house now." "I do." "And somehow that's more important than Mom." I shook my head. "No. My life matters too." My aunt folded her arms. "You've changed since getting that inheritance." "I've changed since being thrown out of my home." Nobody answered. Daniel was the only person who looked at me with understanding. The others looked disappointed. Or angry. Maybe both. Mom had been listening quietly the entire time. She slowly removed the hospital bracelet she'd been absent-mindedly twisting around her wrist. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "So you won't come back." "I won't move back." "You'd rather stay in your grandmother's house." "I'd rather have a healthy relationship with you." She looked away. "You don't get to choose both." That hurt. More than I wanted to admit. I stepped closer to her bed. "I love you." She didn't look at me. "I always will." Still nothing. "I just can't disappear again." For a long moment, all I heard was the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Then Mom finally lifted her eyes. They weren't angry. They were tired. And deeply wounded. She looked at me as though she no longer recognized the daughter standing in front of her. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm enough to make the words hurt even more. "Then you're not family anymore." I closed the hospital room door behind me, expecting another argument. Instead, my mother quietly said, "Grace, stay for a minute." Her voice stopped me. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't demanding. It sounded tired. I walked back to the chair beside her bed. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The steady rhythm of the heart monitor filled the silence while she stared out the window. "I don't have the energy to fight anymore," she whispered. "Neither do I." She let out a weak laugh that barely sounded like one. "I've spent years telling myself I did everything for this family." I didn't answer. I just listened. I kept believing that if everyone else was okay, Then eventually I'd be okay too. Her eyes finally met mine, but that day never came. The honesty caught me off guard. She swallowed slowly before continuing. You probably think I hated your grandmother. I never understood what happened between you. I didn't hate her, she said. I hated how easy everything seemed when you were with her. I frowned. What do you mean? You smiled around her. Her answer was so simple that it almost hurt more than anything else. You laughed with her. You told her your dreams. She listened to you the way I always wished someone had listened to me. She closed her eyes for a moment. I was jealous. The words hung in the room. I was jealous of my own daughter. I didn't know what to say. She wasn't blaming Grandma Rose. She wasn't blaming me. For the first time, she was simply admitting something ugly that she'd been carrying for decades. When I was your age, she continued, I wanted to leave town. I wanted to become an architect. I blinked. You never told me that. Because it didn't matter anymore. She gave a bitter smile. My parents expected me to stay, help my brothers, take care of everyone. Little by little, I stopped asking for anything. I remembered what my cousin had told me. She had sacrificed her dreams for the family. Somewhere along the way, sacrifice had become the only language she knew. So when I saw you becoming a nurse, building your own future, she whispered, I was proud. She paused, and I was angry. The confession hurt, not because I doubted it, because it finally made sense. I thought if you stayed close to the family, maybe you wouldn't leave me behind. So you kept asking for more. She nodded. At first, it was just small things. Watching my nephews, helping with bills, covering emergencies. Then it became normal. And I let it happen. I said quietly, You did because you're kind. No, I replied. I did because I thought love had to be earned. We looked at each other for a long moment. Years of resentment suddenly felt less like a wall and more like two people who had never learned how to stop hurting each other. I'm sorry, she whispered. The words were almost impossible to hear. I believed she meant them, but apologies couldn't erase everything. I forgive you, I said softly. Her eyes filled with tears before mine did. But forgiveness doesn't mean I'm coming back. She nodded without arguing. I know. That answer surprised me more than anything. I don't want you to lose yourself the way I did. For the first time in my life, she wasn't asking me to carry the family's weight. She was asking me not to. I leaned over and gently squeezed her hand. I'll visit. I'll call. But I'm going to keep living my own life. She squeezed my fingers back. I hope you do. Neither of us smiled. We didn't suddenly become the perfect mother and daughter. Some wounds heal slowly, some never completely disappear. But at least we had finally stopped pretending. I stood, picked up my coat, and walked toward the door. Before I stepped into the hallway, I looked back one last time. She wasn't staring at me with disappointment anymore. She simply watched me leave. And somehow, for the first time in years, walking away didn't feel like abandoning my family. It felt like carrying the truth with me instead. A few months passed faster than I expected. The little house no longer felt like an inheritance. It felt like home. Every weekend I crossed one more thing off my repair list. I painted the front porch, fixed the broken fence with help from a neighbor, and planted roses beneath the kitchen window because Grandma Rose had always said every home deserved flowers that welcome people before the front door did. Work had settled into a comfortable rhythm too. My new position at the community health clinic wasn't glamorous, but I loved it. My patients knew me by name. My coworkers actually encouraged me to take lunch breaks. No one expected me to solve every problem alone. It still felt strange. Healthy environments always do when you've spent years living in chaos. Margaret refused to let me spend every Sunday working. You need one day that belongs to you, she'd remind me. Sometimes we'd cook together. Other times we'd drink tea on the porch while she told stories about Grandma Rose that I'd never heard before. She laughed often. She listened even better. Without either of us saying it out loud, she had become family. Not because we shared blood, because we chose to keep showing up for each other. If you've ever discovered that chosen family can heal wounds your relatives never could, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. I still visited my mother. Not every day, not every time she called. Only when I genuinely wanted to. The first few visits felt awkward. We were learning how to know each other without the old expectations. Sometimes we'd only talk for 20 minutes. Sometimes we'd sit quietly and watch television without saying much at all. When she asked me to handle something outside what I'd agreed to do, I simply smiled. I can't do that. She didn't always like my answer, but eventually, she stopped arguing with it. That was new for both of us. Even my brother seemed different. We weren't close, but he no longer expected me to rescue every family crisis. Whether that change came from guilt or necessity, I honestly didn't know. Either way, it wasn't my responsibility to figure out. One rainy Saturday, I decided to organize the attic. There were still boxes Grandma Rose had carefully labeled years ago. Most held old photo albums, recipes, and Christmas decorations. One small wooden box had slipped behind an old dresser. I almost missed it. A faded envelope rested inside. Across the front, written in Grandma's familiar handwriting, were just 4 words. For Grace. When ready. I froze. I thought we'd read everything, I whispered. Margaret climbed the attic steps after hearing my voice. What did you find? I carefully held up the envelope. Her eyes widened. I've never seen that one. Neither had I. The seal had never been broken. After everything I'd already learned, after every secret that had finally come into the light, there was somehow still one final letter waiting for me. I sat down on the dusty attic floor, holding it gently between both hands, wondering what my grandmother had wanted to tell me that couldn't wait until I was truly ready. I carried the envelope downstairs before opening it. Margaret quietly placed 2 cups of tea on the kitchen table and sat across from me. She didn't rush me. She simply waited. My hands trembled as I broke the old seal. Inside was a single letter. The paper had yellowed with age, but Grandma Rose's handwriting looked exactly the way I remembered. My dearest Grace, if you're reading this, it means life has finally led you here, instead of keeping you where everyone else wanted you to stay. I smiled through tears. That sounded exactly like her. I know you'll spend years trying to earn love by giving more than anyone should ever have to give. I wish I could spare you that pain. I had to stop reading for a second. Margaret quietly reached across the table and rested her hand over mine. I took a deep breath and continued. Please remember something I wasn't able to teach your mother. Real love never asks someone to disappear. It never demands that you abandon your dreams, your peace, or your future just to prove your worth. Anyone who truly loves you will be grateful for what you freely give. They will never punish you for having boundaries. The kitchen became very quiet. I thought about every extra shift I'd worked, every paycheck I'd handed over, every apology I'd made for simply needing rest. I had believed that sacrificing myself was the price of belonging. Grandma Rose had known all along that it wasn't. The final lines were shorter. If one day you build a peaceful home, don't spend your life feeling guilty for living in it. Open your door to people who bring kindness inside. Close it to those who only arrive carrying demands. I'll always be proud of you. Love, Grandma. I folded the letter carefully and held it against my chest. Neither Margaret nor I spoke for a while. There wasn't anything left to explain. A few weeks later, I planted another rose bush beside the porch. Not because the yard needed it, because it made me think of her. My mother continued recovering. Some visits were easier than others. Some conversations still ended awkwardly. My brother and I remained polite more than close. Life hadn't magically erased the past. It had simply stopped letting the past decide every tomorrow. That was enough. One evening, after finishing work, I drove home as the sun disappeared behind the hills. The porch light glowed softly. The fresh paint had finally dried. The roses were beginning to bloom. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house was quiet. Not the lonely kind of quiet, the peaceful kind. I hung my keys by the door, set my bag on the chair, and looked around the little kitchen where Grandma's letter now rested in a simple wooden frame. For years, I thought home was a place I had to earn. Then I thought it was something other people could take away. I was wrong. Home wasn't built from obligation. It wasn't created by guilt. It was built one honest choice at a time. I walked back to the front door, took one last look at the apple trees swaying outside the window, and gently turned the lock for the night. For the first time in my life, I wasn't closing myself off from the world. I was simply closing the door to my own home. And somehow, that single, ordinary moment made me realize I already had everything I'd been searching for. If this story stayed with you, I hope it reminds you that love and loyalty should never cost you your peace. Caring for others is a beautiful thing, but not when it means losing yourself along the way. Sometimes the healthiest choice isn't walking away from people, it's learning where your boundaries belong. If you've ever had to rebuild your life, or if this story felt a little like your own, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Your experience might encourage someone else who needs it today. And if you'd like to hear more family drama stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for spending your time with me, and until our next story, take care of yourself.